They called him the Scouse El Chapo, a millionaire drug lord moving tons of cocaine across Europe, living in luxury between Dubai penthouses and British mansions, driving Lamborghinis through foreign streets like he owned the world. Jonathan Cassidy had built an empire that seemed untouchable, protected by encrypted phones and a network that stretched from South America to the streets of Manchester. Police had been hunting him for months, piecing together fragments of evidence that never quite connected. And then, in one careless moment, he sent a photograph. Not of drugs, not of money, not of anything remotely criminal. Just a simple packet of Panadol, the kind of painkillers you'd pick up at any corner shop. Hidden in that innocent image was a fingerprint. And that fingerprint was about to bring down one of the most sophisticated, organized crime operations in British history. Before we dive into this absolutely unbelievable story, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what you think about encrypted phones in the criminal underworld. And make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Britain with notifications turned on. You're not going to want to miss a single detail of how one photograph destroyed a multi-million-pound drug empire. Now, let's get into it. In this video, we're diving headfirst into one of the most unbelievable takedowns in UK organized crime. A story where a millionaire drug importer didn't fall because of a rival gang seeking revenge, didn't fall because of a police ambush in some dramatic raid, didn't even fall because of a botched drug run that went sideways. He fell because of a box of Panadol, a simple packet of over-the-counter painkillers that you could buy for a couple of quid at any pharmacy in Britain. Jonathan Cassidy wasn't some street corner dealer pushing bags in back alleys to teenagers. To the underworld, he'd built a reputation as a calm, calculated operator. A former builder who somehow ended up moving tons of cocaine through Europe, living between luxury homes in the Northwest, Dubai villas with infinity pools, and supercars that most people only ever see in music videos or parked outside exclusive London clubs. People in his circle joked he was the Scouse El Chapo, a reference to the infamous Mexican drug lord Joaquin Guzman. And for a while, Jonathan Cassidy acted like one. By early 2020, Cassidy and his close-knit crew had become serious players in the international drug trade. This wasn't small-time dealing. We're talking multi-million-pound shipments crossing borders regularly, hidden compartments engineered into vehicles with the kind of precision you'd expect from a professional car manufacturer. Cash moved through coded couriers who operated like legitimate businessmen. And international contacts stretching from the coffee shops of Amsterdam all the way to the coca fields of South America. Encrypted phones made him bold. Messages, jokes, business deals, even family photos bounced around between the crew members like they were just mates chatting on WhatsApp. To them, this wasn't incriminating evidence that could be used against them in court. It was just life behind a digital curtain they believed no one could ever lift. A technological shield that made them feel invisible to law enforcement. And then came the moment that changed everything. A moment so ordinary, so mundane, it wouldn't even register for most people going about their daily lives. Jonathan snapped a picture of a simple packet of painkillers, Panadol, and sent it through his encrypted phone to someone in his network. Just another casual message. Nothing criminal about it, nothing bold, nothing dramatic. Probably just letting someone know he had a headache or responding to a question about whether he had any pain relief on hand. But hidden in that image, reflected in the glossy plastic wrapper, was the clue detectives needed. A clue that proved the Scouse El Chapo wasn't some shadowy name on a screen, some digital ghost that could never be connected to the real world. He was real. He was traceable, and most importantly, he was careless. And the walls were about to close in. This is the story of how one of the Northwest's most organized crime groups built their empire from the ground up. and how a single photo, a moment of everyday carelessness that lasted no more than a few seconds, became the catastrophic mistake that brought it all crashing down around them. By the time most people in the Northwest even knew the name Jonathan Cassidy, the groundwork for his criminal empire had already been laid. The route was simple in theory, brutal in execution. Cocaine sourced directly in South America, where it was cheapest and purest, then shipped into Europe through established trafficking routes and finally funneled through Amsterdam, which had become a major hub for drug distribution inside modified vehicles that could pass through border checkpoints without raising suspicion. These weren't amateur hideouts cobbled together in someone's garage over a weekend. They were engineered compartments, professionally designed and built to vanish under torchlight during police inspections, designed specifically to beat roadside checks that border agencies conducted daily, and loaded with anywhere between 120 and 150 kilos at a time. That's the weight of 2 adult men in pure cocaine worth millions on the street. Once the product hit UK soil after crossing the Channel, the network spread like veins across a map of Britain. Manchester, where demand was constant and customers were established. Leeds, with its own thriving drug market and connections to smaller towns across Yorkshire. Birmingham, Britain's second city with a population hungry for cocaine. Glasgow, where the Scottish market offered premium prices, even further when the money was right and the risk was calculated to be worth the reward. Jonathan handled the importation side of things, making the international calls to suppliers and middlemen, negotiating the big agreements that involved tons of product and millions in cash. His business partner, Nasser Ahmed, moved the cash through the system like water through pipes. Collections were capped at £250,000 per run to minimize risk, passed through Bitcoin wallets that couldn't be traced to real identities, unregistered bankers who operated entirely off the books, or trusted couriers who carried sports bags instead of briefcases and looked like they were just heading to the gym. Every pound that came in was cycled back into legitimacy through a sophisticated laundering operation. Land purchases that appeared to be smart investments. Properties that could generate rental income and look like legitimate business ventures. Even a former cinema, which seemed like an unusual but plausible business venture for someone with money to invest. To the outside world, Jonathan Cassidy looked like success. A self-made man who'd built something from nothing. Inside the group, it was simply laundering fuel to keep the machine running, to keep the operation financed and expanding. What made this crew different from the typical drug gangs that law enforcement dealt with wasn't violence or threats or territorial disputes that ended in shootings. It was volume. Regular shipments that came like clockwork. Regular payments that kept everyone happy and loyal. Regular growth that made everyone richer month after month. No chaos that would draw police attention, and no noise that would make headlines in local newspapers. To the people involved, it didn't feel like a gang in the traditional sense. It felt like an enterprise, like they were running a business that just happened to be illegal. Smooth operations, structured hierarchy, and an empire that felt unstoppable to everyone inside it. What they didn't realize was that in this line of work, confidence has a way of souring into complacency. You start to feel untouchable, invincible, beyond the reach of consequences. And complacency always leaves a trail that investigators can follow. They didn't see themselves as street-level runners anymore, as the bottom feeders of the drug trade scraping by on small deals. By 2020, this was a hierarchy, structured like a legitimate corporation, disciplined in ways that would make some businesses jealous, and humming in the background of the Northwest like a secret engine that powered an invisible economy. And at the top of that structure sat one man with cartel-sized confidence, the kind of swagger that comes from moving millions and never getting caught. Jonathan Cassidy, Inside the group, everyone had a role and everyone had a name. Not the ones on their passports or driving licenses, but the ones stitched into their encrypted devices, digital identities that they believed could never be connected to their real selves. Jonathan was Whiskey Wasp, a handle that sounded like something from a spy novel. His brother Jaime, the former football prodigy whose name once echoed around youth pitches in Liverpool, a young man who'd had dreams of playing professionally before life took a different turn, was known as Nuclear Dog. Their partner, the financial architect who made the money move and disappear, Nasser Ahmed, operated under the name Dotted Jaw. And then there was Joshua Avis, the younger link in the chain who handled various logistics using the handle Octol. On the encrypted phones, they lived two lives at once, existing in parallel worlds that they thought would never intersect. One life was pure business, kilos discussed in code, cash movements coordinated down to the hour, logistics planned with military precision, routes adjusted based on police activity and border security. The other life was casual, even domestic. Photos of homes they were proud to own. Family moments captured during holidays and celebrations. Everyday snapshots that any normal person might share with friends. They trusted those devices far beyond their design, far beyond what the manufacturers ever intended. It wasn't just coordination of criminal activity. It was conversation between friends, boasting about successes and near misses, banter about football and women and nights out. Lines blurred between the criminal and the personal, until they couldn't separate the two. Jonathan especially leaned into the myth he was building around himself. One night, while watching Narcos, the popular television series about Pablo Escobar and the Medellin Cartel, he joked that he shared a birthday with El Chapo himself, and sent a screenshot to prove the coincidence. His friend fired back instantly with a message that read, "Coincidence? I think effing not," playing into the idea that Jonathan was somehow destined for this life, that it was fate rather than choice. To them, sitting in their comfortable homes with their expensive watches and designer clothes, it was swagger. It was building a legend. To detectives later, combing through thousands of messages after the encrypted network was compromised, it was a breadcrumb, a tiny piece of evidence that helped establish identity and mindset. Ahmed and Jonathan even shared messages from football trips to Anfield, swapping photos from matches where Liverpool played, standing in the stands like any other fans, pints in hand and scarves around their necks. It was a reminder that for all the scale of their operation, for all the millions moving through their hands, they still carried themselves like local lads from Liverpool who'd simply found a bigger game to play, a more lucrative business than any legitimate career could offer. But behind the nicknames, and the banter behind the football trips and the El Chapo jokes, the confidence was starting to drift into something else. Something more dangerous for people in their line of work. Comfort. And comfort is the one thing an organized crime group should never, ever have. Comfort breeds carelessness. Comfort makes you forget that police are always watching, always waiting for one mistake. The clock was already ticking down to their downfall. But in April 2020, it started to sprint. For detectives working the case from various offices across the Northwest, the timeline would later read like a pressure gauge steadily building toward an explosion. 6 weeks where everything in Jonathan Cassidy's operation moved faster, louder, and riskier than ever before. Deals weren't just being arranged through the usual careful channels. They were being stacked on top of each other. Multi-million-pound loads, one after another, moving across motorways and borders like a conveyor belt of pure profit. Behind the scenes, encrypted messages showed a man who genuinely thought the world couldn't touch him. Jonathan was sharper in his communications, bolder in the risks he was willing to take, and far more careless than he'd ever been before in his criminal career. The bigger the money got, the more unstoppable he seemed to feel. Success had made him drunk with confidence. And then came the moment that summed it all up, that captured perfectly how disconnected from reality he'd become. A simple line sent mid-conversation through his encrypted phone. Scruffy mugs with rucksacks. It sounded like a joke at first glance, a throwaway dig at plain-clothed police officers who Jonathan clearly thought were too obvious in their surveillance techniques. But the timestamp told a very different story. Because at that exact same moment in the real world, beyond the digital messages and encrypted networks, one of his associates was being grabbed by plain-clothed officers, carrying rucksacks. Text and reality perfectly aligned in a way that was almost eerie. For investigators monitoring the situation, that wasn't just a clue among hundreds of others. It was a confirmation, hard proof. A bridge between the hidden world of encrypted messages that they'd been reading and the physical world unfolding on the streets of Liverpool and Manchester. It meant they were reading the right accounts, following the right people, closing in on the right target. Around April, the pace of the operation climbed to new heights. Huge money was moved through the system. Close to £10 million over just 3 months, an absolutely staggering amount that represented hundreds of kilos of cocaine sold on British streets. Orders were placed with suppliers overseas. Routes were adjusted based on changing security at ports and border crossings. And Jonathan's confidence swelled with each successful shipment. But threading through the middle of it all, barely noticed at the time, was one tiny detail. One photograph. One object that meant absolutely nothing in the moment it was captured. A casual box of Panadol, probably sitting on a table or held in someone's hand. A detail so small that none of them realized its significance yet. But it was about to detonate everything they'd built. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. And while you're down there, hit that like button if you're as blown away by this case as I am. For months leading up to that moment, detectives had been piecing together fragments of evidence like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Shipment routes traced through customs data and vehicle registrations. Burner devices that appeared in multiple locations and then disappeared. Cash runs that followed suspicious patterns. Coded handles that appeared in intercepted communications but couldn't be definitively linked to real people. None of it was quite enough to build a prosecution. Everything pointed towards Jonathan Cassidy as the man at the center of the operation. The financial flows, the communication patterns, the lifestyle that didn't match his declared income. But nothing nailed him to the wall. Nothing provided that definitive link between the encrypted accounts and the real person behind them. And then came the moment no one in his organization saw coming. The moment when a multi-million-pound empire started to crumble because of something you could find in any corner shop across Britain. A simple packet of Panadol. It dropped into the encrypted chat like it was nothing. No guns visible in frame, no routes written down, no cash stacked on tables. Just a photograph. Crisp image quality. Well lit by natural light coming through a window. Held casually in someone's hand. The kind of picture people send when they're chatting without thinking. When they're just living their normal lives and sharing mundane details with friends or family. For detectives watching the messages flow through the compromised network, it was background noise at first. Just another meaningless image among thousands. Until one analyst, someone with a sharp eye for detail and endless patience, decided to zoom in. On the glossy plastic packaging, just where the light flared off the wrapper at a particular angle, there it was. A ridge in the plastic. a whorl pattern pressed into the surface. A perfect fingerprint clearly visible in the reflection, pressed into the packaging by someone's thumb or finger when they'd picked it up. Clear enough to lift using forensic software. Clear enough to run through the national database. Clear enough to potentially identify someone. And it matched. The print belonged to Jonathan Cassidy. Not to Whiskey Wasp, the digital ghost, but to Jonathan Cassidy, the real flesh and blood man behind the operation. The man behind Whiskey Wasp. The man steering shipments worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime. The man who thought he was untouchable. One photo, sent without a second thought, without any caution whatsoever, had just confirmed three critical things that prosecutors would need. Identity. This was definitely Jonathan Cassidy. Device ownership. He was the one using the Whiskey Wasp account. And physical possession. He had personally handled items that were being discussed in criminal communications. All in a single shot. All from one careless moment. And it didn't stop there. Once investigators knew what to look for, more images began to slot into place like pieces of that jigsaw puzzle suddenly making sense. Pictures of his house on the Wirral, distinctive interiors that could be matched to property records and surveillance photos, sent to associates to show off his success. Glimpses of family gatherings captured in the background of other photos, showing relationships and connections. Even photographs of the home of Nasar Ahmed, his business partner, which helped establish their relationship and frequent meetings. Photos that were never meant to be evidence, that were just casual snapshots of everyday life, suddenly became a map, connecting people to places, locations to timelines, meetings to messages, all with a level of precision that the investigators hadn't dared hope for when they first started building the case. The first domino had fallen, not from a dramatic raid with armed police smashing through doors, not from an informant turning on the group to save themselves, not from a surveillance van parked in the dark for months gathering evidence, from a packet of Panadol, from a throwaway moment captured in a photograph. A moment that blew open one of the biggest drug conspiracies in the Northwest and gave investigators everything they needed to move forward. And Jonathan Cassidy would never recover from it. The empire was about to come crashing down when word spread through law enforcement channels that investigators were making arrests linked to intercepted encrypted devices. When news outlets started reporting that a major encrypted phone network had been compromised by European police, the mood inside Jonathan Cassidy's world changed overnight. The confidence that had carried him through years of high-level dealing, that had made him feel untouchable and beyond the reach of British law, suddenly had a crack running through it. A crack that was rapidly widening into a chasm. And he didn't wait around to see how wide it would get, or whether the police would come knocking on his door. On the 8th of July, 2020, he made his move. One flight booked quickly, one bag packed with essentials, one destination that had become a haven for people fleeing justice. Dubai. For years, the group had operated behind layers of secrecy that they believed were impenetrable. Code names that obscured identities. Tight circles where everyone had known each other for years. Trusted. Couriers who would never talk to police. Encrypted devices that were supposed to be unbreakable. But now, with associates being stopped and arrested by plain-clothed officers, and messages aligning a little too neatly with police timings in ways that suggested law enforcement was reading everything, Jonathan decided that distance was the safest option. Running was better than waiting to be arrested. Dubai offered exactly what he wanted and needed. Space to breathe without looking over his shoulder constantly. Sun and luxury that his money could buy. And most importantly, a place where money talked louder than suspicion, where British law couldn't easily reach him, where extradition treaties were complicated and slow. Footage later recovered from his social media accounts and from surveillance by investigators showed him leaning heavily into that lifestyle, living like there would be no consequences. Designer watches that cost more than luxury cars. High-end clothing from brands that most people can't afford. The kind of conspicuous spending that turned heads even in a city known for extreme wealth. He drove a Lamborghini through the streets of Dubai as casually as someone taking a corner shop run to buy milk, posting videos and photos online like he didn't have a care in the world. And while he was thousands of miles from home, while British detectives were building their case file and preparing arrest warrants, his browsing history told the rest of the story. Scrolling through luxury interior design websites, eyeing villas worth £2.5 million with ocean views and private pools, trying to perfect the life he imagined staying in permanently, building a new existence where he could enjoy his millions without fear. And then there was the bed. A £22,000 showpiece he'd been in the process of buying from an exclusive furniture maker. Custom-made, probably taking months to construct. The kind of item that symbolized the empire he believed he'd built. The kind of purchase that showed he wasn't planning to leave Dubai anytime soon. One officer later joked when they found the order, "He'll never sleep in that bed now. He'll be sleeping on a prison mattress instead." But Jonathan wasn't the only one making moves. Back in Britain, the investigation had kicked into high gear. Arrest teams were being assembled. Warrants were being prepared. Evidence was being compiled into prosecution files. The net was closing, and it was closing fast. Raids were conducted simultaneously across multiple locations to prevent anyone from warning others or destroying evidence. Homes were searched from top to bottom. Cars were seized and taken apart in forensic garages. Bank accounts were frozen. Properties were put under restraint orders. One by one, members of the network were arrested and brought in for questioning. Nasser Ahmed, the financial architect who'd moved millions through the system. Jonathan Cassidy, Jonathan's brother, who'd gone from football pitches to drug dealing. Joshua Avis, the younger member who thought he was part of something big and exciting. Associates and couriers who'd played smaller roles, but were still part of the conspiracy. During the searches, investigators found exactly what they'd been looking for. Cash hidden in houses, sometimes in walls or under floorboards. Encrypted devices that hadn't been destroyed in time. Luxury items purchased with drug money. Documents that showed property purchases and business investments. Everything they needed to prove the scale of the operation. But the star piece of evidence remained that photograph. That simple image of a Panadol packet with Jonathan Cassidy's fingerprint clearly visible. It was the linchpin that connected everything else together. The piece that made all the other evidence meaningful. Prosecutors began building their case with confidence. They had communications showing the planning of drug shipments. They had financial evidence showing millions moving through accounts. They had witness testimony from some of the smaller players who agreed to cooperate. And they had that photograph, the one piece of evidence that definitively proved who was behind the Whiskey Wasp account. Jonathan Cassidy remained in Dubai for months, believing he was safe, believing that British authorities couldn't touch him in the United Arab Emirates. He continued living his luxury lifestyle, posting on social media, driving supercars, enjoying restaurants and beaches. But behind the scenes, diplomatic pressure was being applied. Extradition requests were being filed. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies was intensifying. Dubai, despite its reputation as a haven for wealthy fugitives, does maintain law enforcement relationships with Western countries. And when the evidence is overwhelming, when the crimes are serious enough, when the diplomatic pressure is sufficient, they do cooperate. The walls were closing in, even in Dubai. It was only a matter of time. And when that time came, When Emirati police arrived to detain him, when he realized that his luxury exile was over, Jonathan Cassidy's empire didn't just crumble. It evaporated completely, like it had never existed at all. The trial, when it finally came, was a showcase of how modern policing has evolved to tackle encrypted communications and international drug trafficking. Prosecutors presented thousands of messages that had been intercepted from the encrypted network. They showed the jury photographs that placed defendants in specific locations at specific times. They walked through financial transactions that traced the movement of millions of pounds. Expert witnesses explained how the encrypted devices worked and how law enforcement had managed to compromise them through an international operation. Forensic analysts testified about the fingerprint found on the Panadol packet and the statistical impossibility that it could belong to anyone other than Jonathan Cassidy. The defense tried to argue that the encrypted communications couldn't be definitively linked to their clients, that handles like Whiskey Wasp and Nuclear Dog could have been used by anyone. But the photograph destroyed that argument. There was no ambiguity, no reasonable doubt. That was Jonathan Cassidy's fingerprint on a packet photographed and sent from his encrypted device. One by one, the defendants were found guilty. Conspiracy to supply cocaine on a massive scale. Money laundering running into millions of pounds. Operating as part of an organized crime group. The evidence was simply overwhelming. When it came time for sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. This wasn't opportunistic crime or small-time dealing. This was industrial-scale drug importation that had flooded British streets with cocaine. This was an operation that had made millions while destroying lives and communities. Jonathan Cassidy received a substantial prison sentence, decades behind bars for his role as the leader and organizer. Nasser Ahmed received a similarly lengthy sentence for his crucial role in moving and laundering the money. Jaime Cassidy, despite his former promise as a young footballer, was sentenced for his participation in the conspiracy. Joshua Avis and the other members received sentences proportionate to their involvement. The luxury homes were seized by the state under proceeds of crime legislation. The cars were auctioned off. The properties were sold. The bank accounts were emptied. Everything they'd built with drug money was taken apart piece by piece and redistributed. And it all came back to that single photograph. That one careless moment when Jonathan Cassidy took a picture of a Panadol packet without thinking about what might be visible in the image. Without considering that his fingerprint might be caught in the reflection of the plastic. Without imagining that such an innocent, everyday action could be the thread that unraveled everything. Investigators later admitted that without that photograph, the case would have been significantly harder to prosecute. They had plenty of evidence of criminal activity, but definitively linking it to specific individuals was always the challenge with encrypted communications. The photograph provided that link in a way that was undeniable in court. It's become a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles about how criminals defeat themselves, how the most sophisticated operations can be brought down by the smallest mistakes, how confidence and comfort lead to carelessness that creates opportunities for investigators. For Jonathan Cassidy, the man who'd called himself the Scousel Chapo, who'd driven Lamborghinis through Dubai, who'd planned to sleep in a 22,000-pound bed in a multi-million-pound villa, reality is now very different. He wakes up in a British prison cell. He eats prison food. He follows prison routines. The empire that felt unstoppable is gone completely, existing now only in court documents and police reports. The encrypted phone that he trusted so completely, that he believed made him invisible and untouchable, became the very thing that exposed him. Every message he'd sent, every photograph he'd shared, every joke he'd made about being El Chapo, all of it was read by detectives and used to build the case against him. And that Panadol packet, that mundane object that anyone might photograph and send to a friend without thinking twice, became one of the most important pieces of evidence in one of the most significant organized crime prosecutions in recent British history. So there you have it. The complete story of how a box of Panadol brought down one of Britain's most sophisticated drug empires. How a fingerprint reflected in plastic became the key that unlocked everything. How confidence became complacency, and complacency became catastrophe. If this story has blown your mind like it did mine, if you've stuck with me through this entire deep dive into one of Britain's most fascinating true crime cases, then do me a favor. Hit that like button to show your support for the channel. Drop a comment below telling me what you think. Was Jonathan Cassidy's downfall inevitable? Or could he have avoided it if he'd been more careful? And most importantly, subscribe to Cold Case Britain and turn on those notifications so you never miss another investigation into the UK's most gripping true crime stories. I've got plenty more cases lined up that are just as shocking, just as unbelievable as this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. I'll see you in the next video.